Welcome to today's special event on Walden University's AI-powered tutor, Julian. It's my pleasure to introduce today's presenters. Stephen Tom is Walden University's Senior Vice President of Student Experience and Chief Transformation Officer. He's focused on delivering a personalized, technology-enabled, and scalable experience that position Walden as a digital leader in higher education, helping students progress further in their journeys. Karthik Venkatesh is the Chief Information Officer at Walden University, where he focuses on improving the educational technology experience for students, as well as faculty and staff, through data analysis, integration, API management, and product management. Lukman Ramsey is Global Head of Solutions for the public sector in Google Cloud, with a focus on smart analytics and AI-based solutions for the education and government. He leads the development of Google Cloud's solutions for education and speaks regularly at conferences around the world about Google's AI technology. At the end of this presentation and demonstration, all three of them will be available for a Q&A on the Walden AI-powered tutor. Now, I'll hand it off to Stephen.
Thanks so much, David. And it's great to be with all of you today as we share Julian, Walden University's dynamic AI-powered tutor, to really help our students reinforce their learning and master concepts. As we think about what the need is for Julian, we start with our adult working professionals who make up Walden's student population. These are people with families, jobs, they caretake for others, they're making an impact in their community. And so we wanted to come up with a way where our students could get that personalized tutoring, get that knowledge mastery they need to move on in their courses, and do that on their own terms, whether it's at night after their kids have gone to bed, on the train on the ride home from work, or even over a cup of coffee at the breakfast table. As we thought about the problem here to solve for our Walden student body, we wanted to start with providing personalized tutoring. That means they're getting feedback that's specific to their strengths and weaknesses. We wanted to apply Julian to non-binary topics, not just things that are right and wrong like math and science, but also in topics like social work, psychology, counseling, areas in which the interpretation and the feedback around that mastery really matters. And we wanted to do it in a way where they wouldn't require us to script it and be able to do it at scale so we could provide it across Walden's 100 plus programs. And so as we talk about Julian today, it's our hope that you see the promise and the potential in Julian, but also as we think about this at large and beyond Walden, think about the places in the world in which we don't have enough educators, or where education is something that we have a need to really reinforce with students around concepts. We believe something like Julian, beyond Walden, can really make a difference in the education and ed tech world. So now let me talk a little bit more about Julian. Right? So Julian is built on top of Google Cloud and utilizes Google Cloud's AI and machine learning capabilities to drive those personalized experiences and knowledge mastery I was just talking about. So what does that mean for Julian? Julian can create its own questions on the fly, completely unscripted. Julian can evaluate student responses, and not just yes or no or multiple choice answers, but also paraphrased written answers, written responses as well, and gauge the accuracy of those responses. It can help students build their notes and more effectively study and create the things that will help them remember the content as they get close to their assessments. And obviously, it can help drive a determination and help react to their strengths and weaknesses. Now, your question is, well, how do you do all of this at scale? We're going to talk about that here coming up and the ways in which our technology team enable all of that to happen. So we here at Walden are proud to say that we are the first to prototype this AI-powered tutor, Julian, in collaboration with the Google Cloud team. And so let me just first talk a little bit about how this all came about. When we first envisioned Julian and started talking to Google, we weren't even sure this would even be possible. And what you're going to see today leverages some of the latest advances in artificial intelligence, in speech recognition, NLP, and conversational dialogue technologies. And so Google has really been at our side through this process, and I want to thank them and Lukman, Ramsey, and team for their collaboration. As I said, we're excited to share this with you, and now I'm going to turn things over to Karthik Venkatesh, Walden University's CIO, to talk to you a little bit more about why Julian is different and what makes Julian possible.
Thank you, Steve. Julian is different than previous iterations of AI Tutor that we've seen. One of the first things we focused on when we started designing Julian was that we wanted it to be completely dynamic. We didn't want to have to think about wanting to script it, have any areas where we would want to do something manually. We wanted to build it for scale. And so today, Julian is a completely AI-driven product. All conversations are dynamically generated by the AI engine. As I mentioned, we also focus on scale right up front. We ensure that Julian is something that could work with various forms of content, various types of interactions. And so when we built Julian and we tested it with both course-based learning using sociology and competency-based learning with our early childhood programs. When we designed Julian, we worked with the Google Cloud team, and we knew upfront that this was heavily dependent on some of the latest research that Google was bringing to us. And with keeping that in mind from an architecture perspective, we really pivoted towards the microservices architecture, and we implemented Julian to leverage this capability. And what this has done is allowed us to be able to plug in and remove things as new things come about and new research from Google comes to us as well. So we can use it as part of the Julian product ecosystem. Julian was a very greenfield project for both organizations. When we started discussing this concept, Google had just released BERT, the transformer machine learning model, and we saw that there was some real possibility that we could do this at scale, completely driven by AI as part of some of these newer things that came about. The Walden team had to really work with some raw research areas, collaborating with Google, and starting to shape things and identifying how all of this would work. We had to focus on various aspects of putting this thing together, things around building products, user experience, data collection, curriculum design. How do we build it at scale? How do we consume data? And of course, data science being a very big part of this exercise. This was challenging, but this is also rewarding. And we kept focused, we stayed focused, we were very agile, and we continued to pivot as we started to face challenges. And now, proud to say that we've been successful, and we have essentially launched Julian as the AI tutor for Walden. Some key considerations that we learned, was to have strong academic partnership, strong business partnership, and the focus on user experience, and being nimble and being able to pivot. These things brought both teams together and really helped us drive this to successfully launch Julian as well. Now let's take a look at the demonstration of Julian.
This is the home screen of the Tutor app, a dashboard that allows the student to select which topic they wish to study with the tutor. The student would typically launch the tutor from the LMS, opening this window. On the left, the major topics for this course are displayed in a menu. This particular course is a competency-based course, so these topics are labeled as competencies. The tutor can also be configured to work with non-competency-based courses. In traditional courses, the tutor would be organized by key concept area or topic. In the dashboard area, the student can see their progress within the tutor on the sub-competencies. This helps the student tune their concept mastery and focus on areas where they need help. They select which subcompetence they wish to study and click on this button to enter the tutor. This is the main tutor screen. On the right is a chat area where the tutor prompts the student and the student can respond by typing. On the left is an area where the student can interact with the tutor or with learning content in various ways. Let's get started. First, I select which learning unit I wish to focus on within the tutor. These learning units are subtopics within this subcompetency as defined by the instructional designers for this course. The learning units are like traditional learning objectives, only more granular. Now the tutor is asking the student to pick one of two options for the learning flow in the tutor. In the first option, the tutor guides the student through various learning activities offered by the tutor. In the second option, the student can pick which activity they wish to engage in. We designed it this way to help orient the student up front, but then as they become more comfortable with the tutor, they can select the activity they prefer. We'll pick the second option now. Now you see the 4 different learning activities currently offered by the tutor. Each of these activities uses AI to generate the learning item, and also in some cases uses AI to evaluate the student response and provide feedback. Let's try Choose the Fact. You see a question generated by the AI, which the student answers to reinforce their learning on this learning unit. Now let's try Create Knowledge Notes. The tutor asks me to select which learning materials contain the knowledge associated with the learning unit. I select the learning materials. I highlight the appropriate content to answer the question. Let's take a quick look at the paraphrase activity. I'm asked to write this sentence in my own words. The tutor uses AI to judge the quality of the paraphrase and give me feedback. Finally, let's try Answer a Question. The tutor generates a question based on the learning unit that I selected previously, also giving me a little bit of context from the learning content as a hint to help me answer the question. I also have access to the learning content, so I can look up the answer if I need to. Here is a different question on the same learning unit generated by the AI. The notes section of the tutor records all interaction between the tutor and the student, effectively guiding the student to create relevant notes and allowing the student to refer back to the interaction with the tutor and the learning activities later. This tutor is an initial prototype, but it shows the promise and potential of using AI to generate on-demand learning activities for students. One of the main challenges in creating educational content is the time and expertise it takes to write formative assessment. This tutor app shows that it is possible to use AI to generate such activities, opening the possibility for truly adaptive learning in which the tutor provides extra practice tailored to the student, based on our knowledge of the student's mastery level and personal learning style.
As you saw in the demo, Julian enables students to learn about content in multiple different ways. And in the coming months, you'll hear more about the ways we're going to enhance Julian to provide even more ways for students to practice and drive that knowledge mastery. But today, we'll highlight 4 of the different things that Julian's doing. So I'll highlight the first 2, and then I'll ask Karthik to highlight the other 2 for you. So first, let's start with Choose the Fact. Here, Julian is generating a question all on its own, completely unscripted, and presenting that question to the student. It's also generating the possible answers on its own. And so it knows the right answer, and it's also generating the detractor or the incorrect answers completely on its own, all driven through the AI that you heard Karthik talk about earlier. So there is no manual scripting There is no question bank behind the scenes. There is nothing seeding this in any way. This is all getting generated on the fly by Julian, and it's doing this based on its understanding and its crawling and interpretation of the content that's made available to Julian. The second one is around knowledge notes. And you saw in the demo the ability for the student to create these Cliffs notes or these individualized notes for themselves. Here, the student is asked to highlight the learning resources or the phrases that is relevant, right, to the competency that they are currently in. The AI has already looked at that content, indexed it, and understands what pieces of content are important for the student to use to create those notes. Those notes actually become an important takeaway. They can use those notes to study for assessments. They can use those notes in writing papers, and they can use those notes to come back to even after they've completed the course. Karthik, do you want to talk about the other two units?
Thanks, Steve. I'll cover the other two. The next one I want to talk about is the paraphrase activity. Paraphrase activity is where Julian is actually dynamically generating a statement and then asking the student to paraphrase this. Just think about this. This is not binary. This is very, very subjective. And the ability for Julian to do this, leveraging AI, is where some of our successes are. The response to this paraphrase activity is actually evaluated by the AI, and it determines how correct the paraphrase is. It checks for the fact whether it's too close. Has it been just copy pasted? Is the statement very similar sounding? And so the AI is actually doing all of these checks on the paraphrase statement that the student has provided. So this really makes the student have to really think about what they want to write and how they want to write and how they want to really paraphrase the statement that was presented to them. The last one is ask a question. And this is where AI is actually dynamically generating a question for the student to respond to. But it is not only generating a question, it is providing a context to the student. And this is very important because, again, we are in a very subjective area. So context is very important. And the fact that the AI is actually able to generate a context and then have the student respond to a question, I think is pretty groundbreaking. And so that's what the students do. They respond to the question, and the AI is able to give feedback in terms of whether the response was correct or not. Well, these are the four key learning activities that the current version of Julian supports. We are very excited about the launch of this product and the launch of this tool for learning for the Walden students. Thank you for providing us the opportunity to present Julian to you. And we are excited to continue to develop and build the next version as we look to the future. With that, handing this back to you, David, and so that we can move to answer questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that great overview and demonstration. So now it's time for the Q&A with Stephen, Karthik, and Lukman. As a reminder, the audience, you can use the Q&A box to submit your questions. So we've gotten a couple already. What feedback have you received from students and faculty?
So Dave, why don't I start, and then maybe I'll ask Lukman and Karthik to chime in here. The feedback's been quite positive. Students who have been able to take advantage of it on their own time, on their own terms. And what they like about it is the dynamic nature of the conversation, that every time they load it up, the questions are different, the interaction is different, the types of ways they can practice are different. And so for reinforcement of concepts, folks have given us some pretty great feedback about that. And also, and a little surprising to us, was the knowledge notes piece, the positive feedback we received on that. We thought that would be kind of a nice added bonus, but people really valued the fact that they could take those notes with them, use those notes in assessments, and continue to be able to reference those in the future. Karthik, do you want to talk maybe a little bit about the feedback on the experience itself?
Yeah, thank you, Steve. from an experience perspective, I think we got really good feedback in terms of how the experience was presented to the students. The conversational nature was really appreciated. It helped the students to be engaged, continue to use it, and so we really, I think we really got some really good feedback around the user experience in general. The ability for the AI to make every conversation unique was also something that was called out. And so that's something, we consciously built into from an experience perspective as well.
Maybe Lukman, you can comment on just, in the early going, as we were starting to show this to people and we were starting to actually realize that this thing could actually work. We got some feedback that helped us make some decisions around the final, version 1 product. Maybe you can talk a little bit about some of the tweaks and things that we did, as we were getting feedback throughout the development process.
Yeah, no, thanks, Stephen. One of the things we really focused on in the development of this tool is, providing support to faculty and basically, making sure they understand that this is a tool that helps them as well as it helps the students. And I think that was one of the things that helped shape the different activities that we're writing. We're really, part of our goal here is to make it easier for teachers, to relieve some of the burden that they have now on creating all of that formative assessment, all those quizzes, all those worksheets by themselves, and allowing them to focus on more of the higher level, educational tasks that really require human expertise. So I think that the enthusiasm that we've seen from faculty for this tool has also been very gratifying as we've gone forward with the development process.
So, Stephen, how do you think this AI technology can influence higher education at large?
I really think it shows a great promise of how we can scale individualized instruction. And not just in higher education, but I also think about K through 12, right? Another large area of need and a place where we have a need for more faculty, more teachers in classrooms. And so, as Lukman said, it's really meant to complement the work of our faculty or of our teachers. And I think, the applications in higher ed, certainly in coursework, is really important, but it also could help somebody through, their doctoral journey. And preparing to write their prospectus or their thesis or their dissertation down the road. You saw some of the power of the paraphrasing and writing evaluation that we were able to demonstrate with this tool. I think in K through 12, certainly lots and lots of organizations have had success in using AI and machine learning in places like math and science. But we think, when you talk about language arts and some of the other more social science liberal arts topics, we think this can have great promise in helping to reinforce learning there. So those are just a couple of the different ways that I think this technology can be much more broadly applied beyond just what we're doing here at Walden.
Lukman, a question for you. What is Google Cloud's focus in this AI-powered tutor?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, we're positioning this as a tool to help education scale by relieving a lot of the more mundane, lower level, drudgery, if you will, around creating instructional materials for teachers and professors, and then also making on-demand practice and reinforcement of knowledge available to students, and in a way that's tailored to them, that allows them to direct the conversation and focus in on the areas that they feel they need the most help in. Again, and that's going to be highly dependent on the context that they're in at that point in time. If they're studying for an exam, they're going to be, using different activities than if they're just, earlier on in the term and just trying to understand a lot of the core concepts. And we did see some of that pattern of engagement as well in our initial prototyping with Walden, where students shifted their use of the tool over the course of the term. So we're really trying to focus on providing a very broad-based enablement of education, personalized education at scale. And some of the next stages of development are really about not just the instructional experience itself, but tying in external feeds of skills and things like that to help provide a more unified context for the tool.
One of the things I might just add, Lukman, to what you said is, I think one of the things you're hearing from all three of us is this concept of scale and on the fly and being dynamic. And so one of the objectives in this, we all in higher education and K through 12 education have seen different attempts at automated tutors or technology-enabled tutors. And a lot of them require scripting or question banks or very kind of binary types of interactions. And what we wanted to generate and prove through this effort was that we can really create those kinds of dynamic, unscripted, but yet very effective, very tailored, and to Lukman's point, personalized types of learning experiences without the need to have, whether it's a faculty member or an instructional designer, do all of that scripting, because that would create another burden, right, on an instructor or on a learning architect to go out and do all of that. And so we wanted to make sure that this technology could be something that could scan that content, index that content, create those conversations. But let me be clear, also still have faculty oversight, right? So we wanted to make sure, right, folks were reviewing the content, reviewing what was indexed, reviewing what the AI had determined was key concepts. But we alleviated the work of folks having to literally create the scripts themselves or create the questions themselves. I don't know, Karthik, if you want to maybe touch on a little bit of that, in terms of that need for scale.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. Yes, I think the need for scale was very important. As I said in the beginning, we really wanted to make sure that from a university perspective, this is a tool or a platform that adds value by generating speed. And as Stephen mentioned, this is as we identify content that we want Julian to present to the students, that we built a process around it to ensure that the Julian, when it works through it, it is able to present it to the faculty. The faculty has the opportunity to review it, determine that everything that is being presented is accurate, as well as working with instructional designers or curriculum designers who would then be able to provide input into how this content would be presented. So I think the process to do that was made so simple as part of this the launch of the product, Julian, that we really can accelerate that whole process and make sure that we are able to add more and more content and different types of content, maybe it course-based or competency-based or other types of content that can then be presented as a learning experience for the student.
So Karthik, how much does a project like this impact the bandwidth that a university's IT team has?
Great question. So when we originally started this in collaboration with Google, we really focused on something that was uncharted. So we in collaboration with Google, we had a team of people whose entire focus was to be able to build and design, build, and launch this in collaboration with the Google Cloud team. I would say, now that we have launched this tool, the effort for an IT team to use this and operate this, I think, is relatively small. I wouldn't say it's trivial, but it is. There isn't a very big need for a large operational team to maintain the product. And it is provided as a software as a service offering. Everything is serverless and cloud. And so this is more about focusing on what problem the institutions or universities looking to solve and the experience that they would like to build. And a core set of IT individuals can then manage and launch the product appropriately. So on an ongoing basis, this is not something that requires a very large number of people to manage the platform. I don't know, Lukman, if you wanted to add more to that.
Yeah, no, we're building different interfaces to enable both instructional designers and professors themselves to load content into the tool, to review that content, as Stephen mentioned before. We always want to make sure that it's humans that are in charge of determining what facts get presented, and the sort of the framework in which those facts are presented. So all of that, does require sort of a curation effort on the part of the faculty or the instructional designers who are loading content in. But then once that content is loaded, then the rest proceeds very automatically. And to Karthik's point, it's all running on a platform that's running in cloud as a managed service, which doesn't really require much, intervention from the institution that adopts the tutor.
I think that's a great segue into the next question. Stephen, how are learning materials imported into the system? For example, are they all open resources, or are they pulled from textbooks and peer-reviewed research articles?
The short answer, David, to that is we can pull them from multiple different places, right? We can pull them from publishers' content. We can pull it from the internet. We can pull it from, it basically is whatever you'd like to ingest into the platform. And so that content really can come from almost anywhere. We've even transcribed video and used that content as potential subject matter, right, for the tutor to draw from. So it's really about what you feed to it. And what, as Lukman said, there is a step in the process where a human being can review it and make sure that the facts and the concepts are indexed and categorized correctly. And then once that's in place, as Lukman said, right, the interaction becomes pretty dynamic from there. I'll just say, in the beginning, we weren't sure how good of a job the AI was going to do in terms of interpreting concepts. But I think much to our amazement, it got better and better as the research was getting close to being published publicly. The research kept coming along in that time period in which we were building this, and we kept seeing step change improvements in its ability to create those kind of conceptual maps of content. And so, it's a long way of saying you can ingest multiple different types of content into the tool, and anything that Julian can interpret, it can use to create those dynamic conversations and create that question and answer content.
So, Karthik, does Julian have a voice, or is it only through written communication?
Great question. In the current version of the prototype, we've primarily focused on the textual interaction. So everything, as you saw in the demo, is around the ability for student to type and get a response. But, and as I mentioned in the beginning of the webinar, we have focused very heavily on the concept of an ecosystem. So building out everything as microservices. So, as we evolve Julian further, there is always an opportunity to add voice and other types of channel experiences that can sit on top of Julian. The ability is there, the technology is there. We haven't reached that point yet, but that the ability for us to do that is there, and we will look at exploring that as we evolve Julian into its next stages.
Well, I'm happy to provide my voice if you'd like it. Lukman, is Google Cloud focusing on the online education industry?
Well, it's fair to say that our early traction has been in that space. Certainly with Walden as our lighthouse customer, the folks that we worked with to develop this technology, we started there. But we're seeing the same things that the rest of the industry is seeing, where online education is becoming more of the baseline, meaning that even traditional on-ground schools are quite rapidly adding online adjunct schools to their programs, and so there's nothing really online specific about this technology, meaning that it could be used by an online school like Walden, or by a traditional on-ground school as well.
Yeah, I was going to say, you can imagine a world in which a traditional university, in which we obviously are brethren to, right? But from an online perspective, we're a little bit different. But you could see a world where a professor is teaching in class, and they've loaded that content into Julian, and students can practice on their mobile phone or on their laptops, as a way of reinforcing that knowledge from class. I didn't want to say as a replacement for a teaching assistant, but it has many of those same things in terms of how it reinforces content and reinforces that learning that they're getting in the class. So to Lukman's point, we don't see it as just an online thing. I think this has broad application, not only in online and traditional classroom, but as we said earlier, higher education and also K through 12.
So, Karthik, what programs has Julian been tested in?
Today, Julian has been tested on two courses. One in the course, our course-based offering in sociology, and the other one in our competency-based offering in early childhood education. So I think those were the two different types of modality of learning that Julian has been tested with. And again, we intentionally focused on these two as separate types because they're separate types of learning for the student. And so we wanted to make sure that Julian can address both types of learning. So those are the two that we have tested it with. More to come as we look to the future.
Stephen, in the future, do you see this technology being used to assess discussion boards in online classrooms?
That could be a very interesting application of this. And as Karthik and Lukman have both said, this is built on a microservices platform. So you can take bits and pieces and parts. If you only wanted to use certain pieces, you could do that. And so, yes, I think it could be used to eventually do other things like grade discussions or used in writing type sorts of learning activities down the road. And I think it can be, I think there's a lot of potential applications as we go. I think, what you're seeing here is really a first version. And, a couple of things, I know this is not exactly the question that was asked too, as people said, and I think Karthik answered earlier, but could it be presented in other ways besides just a chatbot? And the answer is yes. And so that technology, that approach could get plugged into multiple different portions, I believe, of the learning experience. I don't know, Lukman, do you have other kind of thoughts around that in terms of where it might be a good place to plug in from a learning perspective?
Yes. Thanks, Steve. I mean, our goal really is to build, personalized education at scale that's available when and, how students desire that. And so, we'll let the student needs drive the different modalities and interfaces that we focus on. I know, and I'm sure folks who have worked in this space for a while know that there are times when a student isn't able to be in front of a screen. And where having a pure audio-based presentation is really helpful. Again, driving, while in a commute, or on the bus, or in places where they're not able to even directly connect to the internet. And so we as Karthik said, we have the technology to do very seamless, very high quality, dynamic voice generation based on text. That technology has really improved, every year for the last several years. So, I do see as we go forward and as we identify sort of like what's the next most highest priority thing for the students, that we'll be building out interfaces to support those student needs.
So, Lukman, does Google Cloud see this technology being expanded into the K through 12 online learning segment?
Yeah, I think Steve mentioned that earlier as well. We don't see any reason why the same kinds of methodologies and techniques that we've used to generate learning activities, generate formative assessments, could not be directly applied to K-12. We are having discussions with folks that are interested in doing that. So it's just a question of, what do we focus on first? I mean, we've, found the early traction here in higher ed and, in this, more online focused area. But we see this as a technology that will be broadly applicable to K-12 as well as higher ed.
Karthik and I relate to our experience all the time because we have elementary school age children. And what a difference something like this would make in a COVID year, right? In this past year when students were learning online, and they were doing things via web meeting. Think about what this tool could do to help reinforce learning, give teachers an additional way to assess where students are at, but also, drive some personalized instruction with students and understand where their strengths and weaknesses are, all done at scale, for a classroom of 25 to 30 students. I don't know, Karthik, would you agree with that?
Yeah, I completely agree. I can see how this can really benefit students who are in the K-12 space. I think it just is another tool at teachers' disposal that can really add and give that personal attention, especially in an online space. I think one of the challenges I personally have seen is that is my daughter basically wanting more time from the teacher, wanting to understand more at a personal level, and do something like Julian as a tool will allow teachers to be able to do that. So absolutely, I think as Lukman and Stephen said, both I think this tool is definitely something that can be applied in the K-12 space as well.
Karthik, are there ways for students to provide feedback on the tool in real time?
Yes, absolutely. I think every digital experience that we build at Walden, one of our core tenets is to make sure that we solicit student feedback. It's a very important part of our development, and we do that with everything. And then Julian is no different. We have students have the ability to provide to us feedback about their experience with the tool, about what other things they would like to see in it, about the quality of the user experience and various other factors. So absolutely something we do collect from the students, and it's an important part of our development.
Stephen, how do you envision quality assurance for ensuring the content is correct and the way it's assessed?
David, that's a great question. And early on, that was the first hurdle that I think we were all kind of very anxious to figure out how we were going to cross was, could the AI produce credible questions and accurate answers, right? We didn't want to create an experience whereby the technology would provide a wrong answer, right? Or provide an answer that wasn't applicable. And so, a couple of ways we QA that, right? So one is, we've talked about already, in terms of asking faculty members to oversee how the content has been cataloged and indexed, and making sure that they are comfortable with what the AI has identified as key concepts for the course. As Karthik said, we do have feedback mechanisms inside of the tutor. So if people say, "Hey, I don't think this is right," or "I think this is not the right way to present this," we get that feedback from our students. We also, ask our faculty members to extensively test Julian, right, before we put it in front of our students, and actually go through and put Julian through its paces themselves. And one of the best things about it, we keep driving home this point that it's dynamic, is every time they open the tool to UAT or test the tool, it is driving a different dialogue with them. So they're able to test it in different ways, see it ask different types of questions, and gauge, the type of feedback. And so one of the things we're going to keep working on with Julian is how we can provide more directive feedback down the road, right? So not just, hey, is the answer close or not close, or is the answer factually correct or not correct? That is a very, very hard AI problem, machine learning problem that we had to solve in all of this. But then the next step of that is then saying, okay, beyond that, and there is some of this in Julian now, but we want to get to a next level of feedback that really is very specific around what the student can do to correct that answer or re-paraphrase that in a better way. And so those are a couple of the different ways in which we get feedback from the tool. And what I'm pleased to say is, one of the things that gave us a lot of high anxiety early on was one of the first things that we were able to tackle and drive confidence early on that Julian was going to provide a fairly accurate interaction in that experience.
So, Lukman, is this tech focused on undergraduate or graduate learning?
It both, so I think in the two courses that Karthik mentioned that were piloted originally with Walden and Julian, one was a graduate level and one was undergraduate level. So yeah, again, no real restriction on both the level, again, all the way down to primary grades, all the way up to the PhD.
Karthik, can people outside of Walden test this tool?
Not at this point in time. And right now, Julian is accessible only for Walden students. And as we mentioned, we are in phase 1. So it's not available for people outside of Walden at this point. And even within Walden, we are obviously we are testing it with the various courses, so it's available within a certain set of courses as well. So not yet available publicly, but as we mature the platform and the product and collaborate with Google, we will reevaluate that. But having said that, Lukman, I wanted you to kind of jump in and talk about how other people outside of Walden could experience the tool.
Yeah, no, thanks, Karthik. So this is part of a larger initiative at Google Cloud. Walden is our lighthouse, first customer, but we have already started to engage with other interested customers. None that we can announce publicly, certainly at this point. But yeah, our goals for this technology is to really make an impact on education, and to do that, obviously, we're going to have to spread the technology as wide as we can, and hopefully, encourage it to be adopted quite widely across the space. So that's certainly our vision and our goal. Again, we're at the sort of early stages here with Walden, although it does feel like we've been on a long journey already, a few years already working together very closely with a team at Walden. But yeah, we're thinking that in 2022 is when you'll start to see more public announcements from Google Cloud around this technology, and other folks that have started to adopt it. So yeah, we do have big plans coming up for all of this technology.
There was a lot of interest generated by the demonstration of the paraphrasing assessment. Lukman, can you expand on the algorithm that evaluates students' ability to paraphrase?
Yeah, it's it's one of these things that these new foundational language models that we're working with, Steve and Karthik talked about before. That started with the BERT model that was released by Google in late 2018, and really since then has been expanded. A number of other organizations outside Google have built these models. One of the things that they can do is predict the likelihood that a particular phrase would come in a particular context, right? So if you imagine starting with some phrase that was written by a textbook author, right, extracting that, and then having the student write their own version of that. So we can check, using some relatively standard, natural language algorithms that the wording is different, and that it's sufficiently different from the original. We can also check the conceptual structure of the sentence that the student provides to make sure that the knowledge basically and the concepts that are represented in the two are homologous, that they're isomorphic, meaning that the same concepts that are presented in the original are also present in the new. And then finally, we can use these language models to judge how likely would it be that the author, if they had written this, how likely would they have written it in this same context, right in that paragraph or following that previous sentence that came before. So those combined scores basically give us a pretty rich view of what the student has produced, and also gives us the ability to provide feedback, frankly, and tell the student, for example, oh, you missed, you did a reasonable job, but you missed this particular concept, or you failed to mention this important point that was present in the original. So it's a kind of an interesting example of how these advanced language models actually have been termed foundational models by a recent paper that just came out of the Stanford AI group. Because I think language model fails to capture a lot of the power of these things. And they're trained on massive corpora, like all of Wikipedia plus all of Reddit plus, all of the books that are available through Google Books. Those are examples of the size of corpora that these things are trained on. They are imbued with not just how the language is represented in those corpora, but frankly, all of the knowledge that's present there as well kind of gets imbued into these models. And so these are some of the early attempts, that you saw here, these 4 different learning activities that we built into Julian to harness those capabilities. But there are going to be more. As Steve mentioned earlier, I think, this is really just the beginning of the different kinds of learning activities that we can build. And paraphrasing is one of the first that involves writing, but we've already identified, many more opportunities to build other kinds of writing-based learning activities using the same technology.
Stephen, you spoke before about how confidence in the AI was an early focus. How accurate has Julian been in user testing?
It's been really good. I think the feedback that we get is that the questions are on point. One of the things we keep working on is how to make the questions seem more natural, right? When the AI is building the questions, it doesn't necessarily talk like you or I or Lukman or Karthik. And so that's one of the things we're doing. But, in terms of its accuracy, it's been very positive, the feedback that we've gotten from both students and faculty. Part of that, is that pre-curation. And we're doing more and more to improve the ability for the AI to categorize and index on its own. And so it's not to say we'll have a day in which somebody isn't, to Lukman's point earlier, at the controls. We want to have somebody always at the controls and being able to say yes or no or right or wrong. But the more and more we can do that the AI continues to get better at doing those things, the less work somebody will have to do to review and correct. Already, when folks review the content, it's pretty good. There's maybe a little tweaks here and there, or maybe some things that, hey, we missed this concept. I want to make sure that's included here or there as part of a stylistic preference or as part of the preference of the faculty member. But, does it ask wrong questions? No, right? It does it, is it going to provide an inaccurate response? No, right? Based on that. Once that interaction is in, we feel pretty good. Again, with not total certainty, but I would say with a great deal of confidence that it's going to be an accurate and a quality experience.
So, Karthik, one of the pillars here at Walden is delivering a personalized experience. Is Julian different each time it's used by different students? And if so, how can you ensure that students have the same knowledge being reinforced?
Great question. So when Julian is as a product built around personalization. So when a student comes in and is interacting with Julian, he or she would have the experience that they would see is something that is very personalized to them. So yes, Julian as a product is personalized to the student, and we obviously understand the interaction that the student has had with Julian. We understand what the concepts behind it, and the AI engine has been trained appropriately for it to be able to give the right feedback to the student. So it does fall into the personalization experience, and obviously we continue as we mature the product. We will learn more, and we will continue to build on top of the personalization as well.
Lukman, does the AI also learn from the student?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we're actually in this next phase of development building what we call a student mastery model, which essentially judges the mastery of a student on the different competencies, subcompetencies, and learning objectives that have been loaded in and curated by the subject matter experts and the instructional designers as part of that content loading process that we talked about earlier. So we're learning about what the student knows, and then using that to drive more personalization, right? So to generate questions that are tailored to what we think the student needs in terms of mastery. And then the other thing we have the ability to do is generate psychometric evaluation, basically, of the individual items that are generated. So in the first round of development, all of the items were generated on the fly, literally as the student was sitting in front of the tool. But we don't have to do it that way. We can also generate the items in advance. And one of the advantages of doing that is that it provides the opportunity to present the same item to multiple students, and then we're using a combination of deep learning techniques and more traditional psychometric techniques like IRT to do things like infer the difficulty of the item or the alignment of the item to the actual topic. And so that's basically, the system's ability to learn from the interaction that the students are having with individual learning activities and tune those learning activities and make them, higher quality or give, be able to give a more differentiated experience to different students by knowing the difficulty and the relative alignment of those items.
Stephen, at what stage of the implementation are you in, and when do we see all students getting access to this AI tutor?
We're just through our first pilots, but we were excited to share this with everyone in terms of this great breakthrough technology. As Karthik said earlier, we're going to introduce more and more groups and more programs at Walden over time into this. And the hope is that the student body at large, right, the larger Walden population can take advantage of Julian no matter what program. But we're going to keep scaling that, rolling it out. And as you heard Karthik and Lukman allude to, we've got a couple of upgrades planned along the way based on what we've learned from our first group of students who have gone through this that I think are going to enrich the experience that much more and add some of the new types of learning activities that you heard Lukman talk a little bit about to help expand the repertoire of how Julian interacts with our students.
All right, so I think that brings us to the end of our event. We appreciate everyone taking time out of your busy schedules to join us. Thank you for submitting all of your wonderful questions. As a reminder, this webinar will be archived. It can be viewed on demand. The link to access that's going to be sent in a follow-up email. Thank you again to Stephen Tom, Karthik Venkatesh, and Lukman Ramsey for the presentation, and to you, our audience, for joining us today. Everyone, please have a safe and wonderful day. Thank you very much.